Everyone mocked her for marrying a black man. Years later, when her life crumbled, only he stayed, and what he did left everyone speechless. Emma had always believed love would be enough. When she stood at the altar in a simple lace gown, her hand in Darnell's steady grasp, she thought the disapproving stares would melt away with time. That once they saw him the way she did, kind, patient, brilliant, the world would soften. But the softening never came. At first it was subtle. The invitations stopped arriving. Friends she had known since high school stopped calling, their group chats growing quieter until she realized she'd been removed entirely. Birthday parties, baby showers, casual Sunday brunches, all passed without so much as a text. She and Darnell would find out about these gatherings secondhand, through glimpses of smiling faces and tagged photos online, posted without a second thought. Emma tried to explain it away at first. "People are just busy," she'd say, forcing a laugh too thin to hide the hurt. "We're all growing up, lives change." But deep down, she knew. The shift wasn't accidental. It wasn't about busy schedules. It was about Darnell. It was about the way he stood out at dinners, the only black man in a sea of old money familiarity. It was the way conversations shifted awkwardly when he spoke with eloquence and confidence, as if his very existence challenged the quiet prejudices they thought they could hide. Once a family friend at a Christmas party pulled Emma aside, a pitying smile pasted on her lips. "You could have had anyone, darling," the woman whispered, glancing toward Darnell as if he were a stain on an otherwise spotless tablecloth. "Are you sure this is the life you want?" Emma had smiled politely, gripping her champagne flute hard, enough to crack it. The house that once felt like home now echoed with invisible divides. At dinner with her parents, conversation became clipped, formal, like strangers performing a play. Her mother never said it outright, never spoke the venom aloud, but the air was thick with it, disapproval marinated in fake politeness. Even those who smiled at Darnell's jokes, who shook his hand a little too hard, betrayed themselves. In the smallest ways, the tightened shoulders, the glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. Darnell noticed, of course. He always noticed. But he never once asked Emma to choose. He never complained or raged. He simply stayed, offering her the same steady hand he had at the altar, no matter how many others let go of hers. And slowly, the world around them shrank. The wedding guest list that had once overflowed with cousins, co-workers, neighbors, dwindled to a handful of true friends, those rare, precious souls who didn't measure love by skin or status. Emma didn't regret it. Not for a second, but sometimes on the loneliest nights, she wondered how people she once loved could so easily vanish from her life. How fragile their love for her must have been if it couldn't survive her loving someone like Darnell. They hadn't lost her. They had abandoned her. And through it all, when the noise faded and the facades fell, Darnell was still there, holding her hand without needing applause, without needing credit, without ever letting her doubt that she was not alone. At first, it was little things. Emma forgot her keys more often, left the stove on once or twice, laughing it off with an embarrassed smile, misplaced her phone, her purse, her glasses, always finding them in odd places like the freezer or the bathroom sink. Darnell noticed, of course. He noticed the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence, searching for a word that used to come easily. He noticed the way fatigue settled into her bones long before the evening came, how she no longer danced around the living room to her favorite old songs like she used to. "Just tired," Emma would say, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, with a smile too bright, too forced. But tiredness turned into dizziness. Dizziness turned into tremors. The strong, stubborn woman Darnell had married, the woman who once argued politics over dinner and challenged him to foot races in the park, was changing before his eyes. Doctor's visits followed. Tests. More tests. The kind of tests where no one says anything at first, where the silence of the hallway feels heavier than the words that eventually come. They called it a degenerative neurological disease. Slow, relentless. A thief that would take her strength first, then her voice, then, if they were lucky, her Memories last. There was no cure, just management, just patience, just endurance. And so Darnell endured, but others did not. Friends who once filled their home with laughter suddenly became too busy to visit. Family who once promised to always be there grew silent, their absence a wound sharper than any diagnosis. Holiday dinners grew smaller. Birthday celebrations quieter. Invitations dried up like fallen leaves in autumn, crumbling under the weight of polite excuses and awkward avoidance. They didn't say it out loud, no one ever does. But the message was clear. Emma's illness was uncomfortable, messy, inconvenient. And so they drifted, one by one, out of her life. There were no more whispered judgments about Darnell at family gatherings. There were no more family gatherings at all. At first, Emma fought it. She sent cards, she made calls, left voicemails that echoed back in empty inboxes. "Just checking in," she would say, voice bright but cracking like old porcelain. "Would love to hear from you." Sometimes she would sit by the window, phone clutched in her hand, waiting for a reply that never came. The world that had once felt so large, the family reunions, the backyard barbecues, the crowded Thanksgiving tables, shrank until it was nothing but the small, sturdy apartment she shared with Darnell, and the stubborn hope she refused to let go of. Darnell never asked for anything, never complained. He cooked meals she could still chew when her hands shook too much to hold utensils. He adapted their home, installing handrails, lowering shelves, making every small task she could still manage a victory instead of a struggle. He kissed her forehead every night as if she were still the same vibrant woman who had once danced in a white dress, defying the sneers and side eyes to choose him. Because to him she was. Her spirit hadn't dimmed, her worth hadn't lessened. If anything, it had deepened, carved like a river through stone by the trials they now faced together. But Emma felt the cracks in her armor. Some nights she cried into his chest, whispering apologies for being a burden, for being broken. "You didn't sign up for this," she would sob. And every time, without fail, Darnell would pull her closer and whisper back, "I signed up for you." It wasn't the illness that broke Emma's heart. It was the realization that the love she had once assumed was unconditional, from family, from old friends, had been a love of convenience, not conviction. They had loved her when it was easy, when she fit neatly into their world. But when her path grew hard, when her days grew messy, they vanished like smoke. All except Darnell, the man they had laughed at, the man they had warned her against, the man they had once whispered about with pity in their voices. He was the one wiping her tears, the one holding her hand as she struggled to walk, the one carrying the weight of her when her legs refused to obey. The world outside their apartment continued spinning. Birthdays, weddings, promotions, vacations. Emma caught glimpses of it sometimes through news feeds and the occasional misdirected email, but she no longer mourned it because she had something better, something rare, something that didn't wither when the storms came. She had Darnell, and in the quiet spaces between her fading strength and his unwavering patience, she found a new kind of love, a deeper love, a love not built on easy days or polished smiles, but on sacrifice and choice and staying when it would have been easier to leave. The days grew slower, the world grew smaller, but their bond, that invisible tether between them, grew stronger than ever. And though Emma's voice began to falter, her hands began to tremble, and her steps began to falter. Her heart never once doubted whose hand would be there, still holding on when everyone else had let go. It was a Tuesday when the final blow came. A sterile doctor's office, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and old carpet. Emma sat in a wheelchair beside Darnell, her hand resting limply in his. The neurologist spoke in that detached, clinical way, the tone doctors use when the news is too heavy to soften. A few months, maybe less. Her body would fail faster now. Comfort was the only thing left to offer. Darnell heard the words, but they blurred at the edges. As if the room itself recoiled from them, Emma didn't flinch. She only turned her head, found Darnell's eyes with hers, and squeezed his hand. A tremor of strength, a flicker of the woman she had always been. They left the office without saying much. Words had long since become unnecessary between them. At home, Darnell moved quietly into a new role. Not because he was asked, but because it was who he was. He became her nurse, her cook, her protector, her world. Morning by morning, he lifted her gently from bed, cradling her fragile frame as if she were made of glass. He combed her hair, soft and thinning now, speaking to her about mundane things. The weather, the neighbor's stubborn dog, the new plant blooming on the balcony, just to fill the silence with life. He fed her carefully, making meals she could swallow without strain, sitting across from her and smiling even when she could barely manage a few bites. He read to her, novels they used to argue about, poetry she once hated but now seemed to savor. His voice filled the small apartment, wrapping around her like a familiar blanket against the cold. There were nights when she cried, nights when she was too tired, too humiliated by what her body had become. But Darnell never turned away. He never flinched at the worst of it, the indignities of sickness, the raw vulnerability, the ugly reality that no one else wanted to see. Where were the others? The ones who had cheered at her college graduation? The ones who had toasted her engagements and fawned over her wedding registry? Gone, silent, absent. Some sent flowers, generic cards with impersonal messages scrawled in a hurry, thinking of you. Sending prayers, but they never came. Not a single knock at the door, not a single chair pulled up beside her hospital bed, not a single hand reaching out when hers grew too weak to hold a spoon. It wasn't the disease that isolated her. It was shame, their shame. They couldn't face what they had abandoned. Couldn't bear witness to the loyalty of the man they once dismissed, a loyalty that made their own failures glaringly, unforgivably obvious. And so, they stayed away. Darnell stayed, day after day, night after night, until her breathing grew shallow, and her skin grew translucent, and her voice became no louder than a whisper against his ear. And still, he stayed. One night, near the end, Darnell sat beside her bed, cradling her frail hand between both of his. Outside, the world carried on. Cars passing, televisions humming, laughter echoing from distant apartments. Inside their little world, time moved differently, slower, softer. Emma struggled to speak, her lips trembling with the effort. Darnell leaned closer, brushing a stray hair from her damp forehead. "I'm not scared," she whispered, each word a mountain to climb. Darnell smiled through the sting in his chest, squeezing her hand gently. "I know, baby," he murmured. "You're the bravest person I've ever known." Tears slid down Emma's cheeks, but they weren't from fear. They were from love. Fierce, abiding, undefeated love. She blinked slowly, her gaze locking with his. In her eyes there was no regret. No sadness for the life she chose. Only gratitude. Only love. She exhaled one final soft breath, the corners of her mouth lifting in a ghost of a smile, as if she were slipping away not in sorrow but in peace. Darnell stayed. He stayed long after the machines went quiet. Stayed as the nurses moved gently around him, whispering condolences he barely heard. He stayed because that's what love looks like, not the showy declarations or the polished Instagram moments. Love is staying when no one is watching. When there's nothing left to gain, when the world forgets but you remember, when the woman you chose against all odds reaches her final moment, and you are still there, holding her hand, just like you promised you would be. They had laughed when Emma married him, sneered behind their perfect smiles, predicted her ruin. But when the final page turned, when her story ended not with thunder but with a whisper, it was Darnell, the man they judged, the man they underestimated, who proved what none of them ever could. True love isn't about approval, it's about presence. And Darnell had been present for every single breath, every single heartbeat, until the very last one. The apartment felt different after she was gone. Quieter, yes, but not just because her laughter no longer filled the spaces between their walls. It was quieter in the way a cathedral feels after a prayer is whispered. Still, sacred, forever. Changed. Darnell moved through the room slowly, touching the objects she had once loved. The worn corner of the couch where she liked to read. The kitchen table where she insisted on setting 2 places, even when she could barely sit up to eat. The faded photographs taped to the fridge, not the polished holiday portraits, but the candid, messy ones where her head was thrown back in real, reckless laughter. There was no grand funeral, no parade of mourning relatives. Those who had once filled her life with judgment now filled it with silence, an absence louder than any eulogy could have been. A few sent flowers. Most sent nothing at all. Darnell didn't mind. He understood. Something they never had. Love isn't proven at the wedding altar, surrounded by flowers and champagne. It's not proven in carefully curated photos or in the polite clapping of people who only stay as long as the music plays. Love is proven in the empty rooms, in the sleepless nights, in the meals fed by trembling hands, the tears wiped away without witnesses, the endless patient staying. It's proven when the bright days fade and only the hard, slow, aching days remain. And you stay anyway. Darnell stayed. When Emma's voice faltered, he became her words. When her legs failed, he became her strength. When her world shrank to the size of a hospital bed, he became her universe. Not because anyone was watching, not because there was glory in it, but because real love is a choice made 1,000 quiet times, in 1,000 invisible moments, with no applause and no guarantee of thanks. He stayed because that was the promise he made, not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but with the simple, stubborn act of holding her hand and meaning it. In the weeks after her passing, Darnell walked their familiar neighborhood routes alone. Sometimes neighbors would nod awkwardly at him, their faces tight with the guilt of those who had once turned away. Sometimes they crossed the street. He let them. He didn't need their approval. He never had. He had Emma's love, and she had his, and that was enough. One afternoon, Darnell found himself sitting alone on the park bench where he and Emma had once shared coffee and argued over politics. The sun was setting low, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose. He closed his eyes, feeling the breeze lift around him, and he smiled. A small, real smile, because he knew she was part of that sunset, part of the wind, part of every stubborn, beautiful thing that refused to fade quietly. They had laughed when she married him, mocked her, pitied her, but at the end, when the storms came and the false friends fled, he was the only one left standing. The one they judged stayed until the very end. The one they doubted proved, without saying a word, that real love is not easy or convenient or always beautiful. Real love is silent, sacrificial, steadfast. It is staying when it hurts. It is loving when it's hard. It is holding a hand until the very last breath and long after.